I thought, oh my God, we're all walking around with generations of sexual shame in our bodies, in our systems, in our fields. The power of being able to not just shift my individual perspective, but shift the collective field of sexual shame, like the power in that for sexual liberation as a collective just totally blew my mind. And so then I was like, well, here we go. Let's learn how to do this.
I'm Cindy Darnell, and welcome to The Erotic Philosopher, the podcast where we examine and explore sex and relationships through social, cultural, political, and other lenses, and discover ways to solve some very diverse and stimulating erotic quandaries. Today's guest is Elise Bish. Elise is a conscious sexuality educator, folk herbalist, and family constellation facilitator. She believes that sex is sacred, pleasure is healing, and desire is our motivation to grow. Welcome to The Erotic Philosopher. It is absolutely delightful and wonderful to see you. Thank you for making time during a pandemic to come and talk to us.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to dive in with you.
So I've known you for several years now, and we really met through Barbara Carrella's. And from the minute I met you, I just thought you were utterly delightful. And I think you bring something really unique to the world and to this work. And by way of introduction, how would you describe what you do? Because it's really unique.
I do kind of have a unique inroad into the world of sexuality. So I call myself a desire catalyst, and I support people in creating an inspired relationship to their desire, their body, their sexuality. And I use a unique process called systemic family constellations to really work with the bigger transgenerational patterns and the larger consciousness that kind of exists in our bodies, in our psyche, in our DNA. And it kind of helps us to see the bigger patterns of why we relate to our desire and our sexuality the way that we do.
First of all, that is extraordinary. And second of all, can you break down what you mean? What did you say? Transgenerational patterns. So talk us through that as if we didn't know what you were talking about.
Totally. So it's this idea that we inherit certain ways of being from like through our lineage, from our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, and before. And these things play out in patterns that kind of repeat themselves over and over again. And there are a lot of ways that we inherit those patterns. One way, that's kind of obvious is the way that we're taught to be, beliefs, behaviors, things that our parents teach us as we move through our lives as children. So this happens, a lot. You can see the way that our parents influence the way that we are around sex and relating, or the way that our parents' relationship kind of teach us how to love and relate and to share intimacy and to interact. So that's kind of like one base level that we inherit those patterns. And, your grandmother teaches your mother how to love, your mother teaches you how to love. And then there's the genetic shifts that happen in our DNA transgenerationally. And there's a lot of research around epigenetics that talks about, how our DNA shifts after trauma or after, a big event in our lives, that our DNA shifts. And, we see it in nature all the time, the way that elephants remember watering holes that they've never been to, that their grandparents have been to.
That's so fascinating.
Isn't it? And we're the same way. We have those same shifts in our DNA that help us remember.
Wow.
Things that happen and teach us different things.
And so how did you come to even know that this work was a thing? What's been what was your calling to this work?
Yeah, so I was working in the field of sexuality. I had been working and studying for probably about 5 years at this point. And, I was going to a lot of workshops and events and offering, regular kind of sex ed teachings. And I met a woman at a workshop. Her name's Emily Blayfeld. And we became fast friends as well. And she was doing this work. At the time, I was really kind of getting a lot of street harassment.
Oh.
It was just like a thing that happened to me in my life all the time. Didn't matter what I was wearing, where I was going. It was kind of a lot more intense. I know a lot of women experience street harassment.
Yeah.
And so I knew that I wasn't alone in it. And it was just something that I kind of had accepted as part of my life. And then one day she witnessed me being street harassed on a random, like, small little bike path in the middle of nowhere in Rhode Island. And she looks at me and she goes, "That's, like, not normal what I just experienced." I think that there's something in your system that's kind of putting you in this victimized position. And so we did a constellation around it. And it was my first experience with the process. And through the process, I got to see how, through generations in my lineage, the women were kind of placed in these victimized places, especially when they were stepping into their sexual power.
Oh.
Yeah. And so I got to see the pattern kind of come through and all the ways that, my grandmothers were kind of put in this victimized place and how the sexual violence kind of arose in my system. So essentially, as I was walking down the street as myself, carrying this pattern of victimization, it was kind of igniting the patterns of violence and perpetration in the men I was just interacting with. And, that violence would be directed towards me.
Right.
And so after the constellation, everything shifted.
It's remarkable. And because then as you're telling that story, it makes me think about, the dudes who think that kind of behavior is okay, how, that culturally it's been supported that they can get away with that kind of stuff, and the degree to which that's embedded in their DNA as well. And that, for us to heal, the interactions that happen like this, the sexual violence and the street violence and just the complete discomfort and disregard that so many people have around expressing sexuality and expressing gender in various ways, that it leads to so much pain for people and so many problems, that this system is a way of looking at not only where that pain comes from over so many generations, but also how to heal it at a deeper level than just regular talk therapy could provide.
Totally. And, I was kind of processing my own experience of, like, being kind of on the receiving end of that. But I had been in therapy for probably a decade at that point for, working through all of my things.
Yeah.
And in this one process, it shifted. That was probably 8 years ago. And, everything has changed. And I think for me, that was like the big turning point, was seeing, I was just walking down the street like I was walking down the street before the constellation, before this ancestral healing. Yet people were responding to me differently. There was clearly a systemic interaction between what had shifted and the world around me. And I thought, oh my God, we're all walking around with generations of sexual shame in our bodies, in our systems, in our fields.
Yeah.
And, like, the power of being able to, like, not just shift my individual perspective, but shift, the collective field of sexual shame, like the power in that for sexual liberation as a collective just, like, totally blew my mind. And so then I was like, well, here we go. Let's learn this. Let's learn how to do this.
And so in the capacity that I know you, I know that you also work a lot with plants and flowers in particular, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think my kind of fairy sensibilities really, I work a lot with flowers, but yeah, I'm a folk herbalist and I bring herbalism and plant consciousness into my work as well. Yeah.
So Elise, tell me about the relationship between the herbalism and ancestral healing, if there is a relationship.
Yeah, I definitely think that there's a relationship. I came to herbalism through the consciousness community. A lot of the work that is systemic family constellations is kind of working with not just the stories and the memories of our ancestors, but the greater field of consciousness. So this kind of energetic experience that's also part of how we inherit patterns. And came to herbalism from a place of really wanting to understand consciousness better and working with plants from the perspective of, awarding plants and the earth and these kind of bigger fields of earth consciousness, the agency that they deserve. And so a lot of times the wisdom of herbalism are things that, regardless of where you come from, your ancestors worked with plants. They knew plants as medicine. They understood the reciprocal relationship and the intimacy that existed between humans and plants, and the way that that medicine and that connection really kind of deepens our experience of life. So working with plants to me is really a process of really remembering.
Oh, I like that.
Remembering our ancestors, remembering the connection to the earth, remembering that we are of the earth. So there's kind of a beautiful way that when you make plant medicine, you're kind of recalling the ways that our ancestors have worked with the land and worked with that wisdom, and honoring and acknowledging the power of that.
There's definitely something so ancient about those practices. And I mean, you're right that they transcend, national borders and race borders and those sorts of things. Like every human culture on the planet in the present has a history of relationship with plant medicine. And the fact that I think these days it's sort of dismissed really just erases how many thousands and thousands and thousands of years of wisdom and knowledge that is just completely overlooked when we're looking for, pills and ointments and things. Not that these things are necessarily in opposition to each other, but it feels like sometimes they get pitted against each other unnecessarily, rather than actually looking for how healing works, as opposed to black and white answers of this is right and this is bad, or this is good and this is wrong. So what do you wish that people understood more about what you do? What is a thing or an example of things that sort of people struggle with regarding the work you do and how you do it?
I think I just hold kind of a bigger wish for all of us that sexuality is something that's valuable and important and healing, and that we all need support with it at some point in our life. I think that's kind of just the base desire that I have, that it's something that we need support around. It's something that's deserving of our attention and our time. And that pleasure is really, the point. It's like the point of life. So I think that's kind of like the baseline. And then, from there, kind of moving deeper, is that part of the reason that we have such challenges around sex and intimacy is because there is this bigger field of oppression and lineages of silence and shame that we all carry these memories of. And, of course it's hard. It's been kind of pressed down and mixed up in all kinds of legacies of oppression, and that we have to do our work to really look at not just how those things live in us, but how we can kind of support the sexual liberation of all of us through creating space and understanding our sexuality, and getting education that really serves our pleasure.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing that is so crucial, and really what even led me to make this podcast, is how much information people don't have about sex, and that sex education is so much more than where do babies come from, and that is probably the least interesting part of sex education for some people. And through the perspective that you're bringing with this, how this is not just you as an individual having an individual experience, that this goes way, way deeper, and what we bring from our families of origin, what we bring from our ancestors who we've never even met, and how people all over the world can have really similar experiences, because there doesn't appear to be a culture that's worked out how to manage sex in a way that gives it the reverence that it deserves, that it's still something that's sort of considered, as you say, unworthy and shameful, when really life is about pleasure, and life should certainly be only about that.
Yeah.
So, Elise, I have a letter for you from one of our listeners. Are you ready to hear it?
Yeah, I'd love to hear it.
Okay. Dear philosophers, that's us. I'm 30 years old and I really want to be in a relationship, but I always seem to choose the wrong people or end up in situations where I feel unloved and disconnected. I get together with people and then I quickly lose interest in sex. My therapist pointed out to me that I'm the fourth female generation in my family to be single, from my great-grandmother, my grandmother, my mother, and now me. All of them were single mothers for different reasons, and I want to have a baby, but I don't want to be alone. So that's from Patricia. Elise, this is a really, Patricia's insight is pretty powerful, but also I think it's a really common experience, and also it's profoundly insightful, I think, for Patricia to connect these dots and to be aware of it at such a young age. Is this something that you see a lot in your work?
Yeah, definitely. And I would say if you're out there and you're thinking like, okay, what have I inherited from my ancestors? What patterns am I carrying around? Looking for these repeating situations that kind of come up again and again, where there are a lot of similarities between you and your parents, you and your grandparents, you and your great grandparents, if you're able to track them back. If not just looking at things that come up in your life over and over again, right? Like that situation of like, I keep falling in love with the wrong type of person. Those repeating patterns, especially if we've worked on them in therapy, especially if we've done workshops around them, we've taken classes on them and nothing has shifted. Those are the patterns that are very oftentimes connected to an ancestral entanglement, something that kind of goes deeper and started much, much earlier than you. So those kinds of patterns are the places where you want to look like, okay, maybe there's something here that needs to be acknowledged and understood.
Mm-hmm. So in a case like hers, where she wants to get married and she's scared, or she wants to have a baby, and she's scared that she will end up being a single mother also because of this pattern. And also that she says she gets into relationships and then loses interest in sex. As a practitioner in your craft, how would you approach a dilemma like this?
Yeah. So I would kind of start with what are some of the conscious beliefs that she's holding around relationships, sex, intimacy, partnership, that she knows that she can identify kind of right off the bat. Oh, she might not agree with those beliefs, right? She might not agree with the conditioning. It might be like, oh, well, my mother thought this, or, when I think about relationships, this is the belief that comes up, but I don't prescribe to it, but it still somehow kind of runs my life, right?
So that could be things like, relationships are supposed to, I don't know what, supposed to last forever, or when you meet the one, immediately.
Yeah. Or something as simple as like men are unreliable and will leave you, right? Like that's something that she might be kind of sitting with, that belief. Or that that you have to protect your sexuality and save it for the right person, or any kind of belief.
Or to have a child, you have to do it with a man,
right? Yeah.
That it's not feasible for two women to raise a child together.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Or that you have to show up a certain way in order to be lovable. Kind of what are the beliefs that she can identify that exist in terms of partnership or in terms of sexuality, and then sit down and look at those beliefs. Whose voice are they in? Where did they come from? Who are they in service to? Because a lot of these beliefs and the conditioning kind of come out of these power dynamics that try to control our bodies and control our sexuality. So who is benefiting from that belief? Oftentimes it's not us.
Yeah. And so are they questions that you would directly ask?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would sit down and kind of go through each belief and look at this, like, who is it in service to? Where did I learn this belief? Whose voice is it in? And then, do I believe that it's true?
Yeah, right.
Do I get to choose whether or not this belief is true for me? And if you're like, no, that really serves capitalism, or that really serves patriarchy, or that really serves, the Catholic Church, whatever.
Right. Yeah.
You can, shift that belief and decide that, it's not something that you want to bring forward.
So when one has discovered that there's a belief that they don't want to bring forward with them. How would they go about working with that or changing that or replacing that?
Yeah, so I would start by like writing a belief that's more true for you.
Huh.
So like if the belief that I got was that sex is supposed to be, that sex is supposed to be amazing, that sex is natural, right?
That's a really big one, yeah.
And I'm just supposed to know how to do it, right? Or, that sex is something that should just be good with the right person, right? Those are kind of big beliefs that come along. You're like, well, no, sex is an art and it's a skill. And, I have the power to get the education I need to create a sustaining relationship. Or, sex is something that needs to be nurtured and cared for in relationship. And I'm going to choose to put my energy in towards nurturing that part of my relationship. And so now that you have those kind of beliefs that feel more true for you, right? I kind of encourage a questing of like what parts of my body, what sensory experiences, like where does that belief live in my body? And, if you really want to bring in the ancestral pieces, you can also ask, like the question often is in constellations, not what is the problem, but who. Not necessarily who is the problem, but who is it connected to?
Interesting.
Our bodies remember, our DNA knows. So, kind of just going into a meditative space, feeling in your body, when I hold on to this belief that, that sex is only for the right person, right? Like, where does that belief live in my body?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
And then, who else in my system believes that?
Yeah.
And you might get memories or images or feelings or, just a kind of knowing of where that belief comes from.
And I think that's one of the things that's really powerful about how, body-based therapy, somatic therapies, this kind, any therapy that involves the body is really different to your bog standard talk therapy, is that wisdom doesn't necessarily appear in thoughts and it doesn't necessarily appear in words. It can be sensations, it can be having a stomach ache or feeling tension or having a dry mouth or wanting to itch or a sensation of wanting to run. I mean, I remember years ago I worked with a woman who was a trauma survivor, and during session when she was talking about the stuff that had happened to her, I noticed her legs jiggling around a lot, and I said, "What's going on with your legs?" And she said, "I'm uncomfortable." And I said, "What do they want to do?" And she said, "They want to run." And so I invited her in the room to just start running around, and I got her to run until she was exhausted. And then I said, "Now, how are your legs?" And she said, "They feel much better." And that was actually a real breakthrough session for her. She said that, being able to actually take wisdom from her legs rather than us sitting there talking about even her emotions.
Yeah.
That cutting through and just going, let's follow the body instead and see what it's got to say. And so then you're bringing in this extra element of not the what, but the who, going way, way back. And so, taking it back into like Patricia's situation where there's this thing of not wanting to, being afraid of being a single mother and holding this fear because she's, got this evidence, as it were, of 4 generations. How would you dig into that fear about being abandoned with a child?
I would locate that fear. Where does it live in the body? And, working with the fields of consciousness, like I do, there's a way that you can kind of step into that fear and get more wisdom from it. So, how does it affect my body? What are the circumstances that are attached to it? What is it trying to keep me safe from? And, kind of just like let the field of that fear kind of inform what it's there to teach you, what it's there to offer you. Oftentimes, we carry those patterns forward out of love and loyalty. So there's a way that fear is trying to keep us safe. That your great grandmother experienced, something that shifted her life.
Yeah.
And created that pattern of fear. And you carry it forward probably because there's something unacknowledged there's a way that something was pushed out or forgotten or, unacknowledged in her that carried that fear onto the next generation and to the next generation and ended up in you. So figuring out and acknowledging, like, what's the story that this fear came from?
Yeah.
And, if you know that it comes, you can kind of walk with that fear through the generations. So take a step. How does it exist in my mother, in the way that she carried me and cared for me as a single mother? How did it exist with my grandmother?
Yeah.
How did it exist in my great grandmother? And you'll notice the kind of intensity and the quality of that fear changing as you walk it through the generations, as you make contact with those ancestors and the consciousness that they brought to it. And, sometimes all we need to do in that process is just acknowledge that fear isn't ours.
And that can be so incredibly liberating, I think. When we can acknowledge that there is an option for us to put the burden down simply by acknowledging that it's not ours to carry and to move forward.
Yeah.
And I think with this work, it invites, it's sort of like trying to describe pizza to somebody who's never eaten it. It's, because I can sort of say, well, there's cheese and there's tomato and there's spicy, chili and, pepperoni and stuff. And people are like, oh, you mean like a grilled cheese sandwich or something? And it's like, no, it's not like that. Just eat it, and then you'll know what it is. But I can't describe it to you until you've eaten it yourself. Doing this kind of work, it's so visceral, isn't it? And it's being able to lay down a burden like, the fear that we carry through from ancestors sometimes is something that when you actually put your body into it, it starts to make sense in ways that the conscious mind, the cognitive mind, just does not comprehend.
Totally. And I think part of that, particularly for Western culture, is because we've completely disconnected ourselves from the value of ancestral wisdom. There are a lot of cultures that connect with ancestors, that living cultures that have deep roots with their ancestors, that really work with them. Like a living relationship. And, in the West, in a lot of Westernized cultures, we've lost that connection. So it can sound kind of unreal or unfounded. And, I do think the process itself is kind of challenging to understand. It really is a felt experience. It's somatic. I think that's also part of what really inspired me to bring it into sexuality work, because so many of us are numb or disconnected or disembodied or disassociated, especially if we've had trauma. So, you get this felt sense that oftentimes our ancestors are working through us, through the somatic experience of our bodies.
Yeah.
Through the sensation, through the felt sense. If you ever have an emotion that's much bigger than the experience that's in front of you, oftentimes there's an ancestral component to that amping up those emotions is the way that they communicate what's going on for them.
And being open to receiving that information and receiving that wisdom, despite the fact that it doesn't make sense, despite the fact that it's illogical in quotation marks. It just gives us so much more breadth to work with.
Yeah.
And I think especially when we're working with sexuality, nobody wants logical sex.
Yeah.
They want, do they? People want to feel free, and they want to feel abundant and buoyant, and they want to feel passion. They don't necessarily want to feel logical.
Yeah.
And yet we try to solve sex problems logically, and it's
right.
Like, why do we do this?
Right. Right.
Why not go to the source, which is the body?
Yeah. And when we want that free, passionate, uninhibited sex, oftentimes, we're met with the polarity of that. We're met with the shame, and the fear, and the awkwardness, and the, the low desire, right? All of these things. And you're like, wow, but I don't understand. I want amazing sex. And yet, here I am meeting the polarity of that. I want amazing pleasure. And here I am sitting in my shame. And it's like, why? It doesn't make sense. If I want this thing, why can't, why? And I know how to get it, right? Here's the roadmap to get it. Those are moments where we can look at, the bigger context of how we've been brought into and what exists in the kind of larger field of our sexual knowledge, our sexual wisdom.
Yeah. And I think, that's why I wanted to, I thought Patricia's particular situation and problem was going to be a perfect one for you to untangle. And while something as complicated as ancestral lineage is not really a problem to be solved, I like that you talk about the questing, the being able to sort of go into something with a curious mind as a mode of healing, rather than saying, I'll be healed when the problem no longer exists. It's more a question of, I'll be healed when I've given myself the freedom to actually experience myself much more richly and broadly. And when you don't know how to do that, that feels very foreign. And your proposal of going through the body and listening to that wisdom in a step-by-step, structured, guided way, obviously, is really crucial. So I am certain people are going to be very curious about getting in touch with you. Is this the sort of work that you can do online as well, or do people need to be in your physical presence to work with you?
I do offer online one-on-one constellation sessions where we can really dive in virtually. It's helpful if you have some privacy and some space, some physical space, because we will be in our bodies for the process.
Yeah.
And if you want to do them in person, when it's safe after the pandemic to do them in person, I also have a practice in Providence, Rhode Island, where we can really dive in and do in-person work.
Elise, before we wrap up, let folks know where they can find you.
Yeah, you can find me online. I have a website. It's elisefish.com, ELISE, B as in boy, ISH.com. And you can also find me on Instagram at Desire Catalyst. I do lots of fun Instagram lives and free classes on Instagram, so check me out there too.
You do. I've seen you've been very active with your Instagram lives, and I think I watched one of the first ones that you did. And how are they going? Are folks responding to those?
Oh yeah, I think I'm loving them. We're doing my colleague and good friend, who's my herbalist teacher, my kind of mentor in herbalism. We do have a program called Earth, Eros, Embodied, where we combine conscious sexuality education, this ancestral healing work, and earth magic and plant consciousness and folk herbalism. And we're doing Instagram lives called sensual care circles, where we work with an herbal practice and an embodied practice to really tend your sensual self. So we're doing those 2 times a week, and they've been going really well. I think people are getting a lot out of them, keep showing up. So I enjoy them. I'm like, hey.
Yeah, you enjoy them. So that's even better.
Yeah.
Elise, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for carving out some time in your day today. And I can't wait till I can see you in person again when we're back into I won't say a normal routine, when we're back into some sort of physical routine. Let's just say that.
I can't wait.
Hello, listeners. To submit an erotic quandary for the philosophers to ponder, follow the Erotic Philosopher on Instagram and Twitter at the Erotic Philos. That's PHILOS. And click on the Google form link in the bio. And to discover more about my online sexology courses, as well as how to work with me directly, head on over to cindydarnell.com. That's CYNDIDARNELL.com. Thanks for listening.